Let me get a brief rundown of your history in psych. What was your BA? What made you want to go into that psych track and become a psychologist? And what kind of psychologist are you?
Yeah, so I'm not a psychologist. I'm a marriage and family therapist.
Okay.
And a licensed professional clinical counselor, although I'm not licensed yet.
Okay.
So I'm an associate. But man, my route to getting into therapy and psychology was an interesting one. I studied business in undergrad, business management. My route to get here, I went into the music industry for a while right out of school. Was managing like songwriters and producers, and it was a really cutthroat environment. And I quickly found out that that wasn't for me. Then I went into marketing and media, and that was great for a while. I love media. I felt like where I was, it just wasn't lining up with where I wanted my future at the time. So from there, I felt, it's interesting. I've had a self-growth journey, which led me here. So in those early years after college, I felt very unfulfilled. And I was like searching. I was always searching for something because it felt very empty. And after so long of that feeling, I started exploring. I did always have courage to explore new things. So I was always willing to try things, see if I like it, see if I'm good at it. Tried rapping for a while. That was embarrassing. Looking back on it, I wasn't very good, but I was always willing to try things. So after media, while I was working in media, I didn't tell anyone except my wife, but I tried my hand at acting. I started taking acting classes, and I just fell in love with it. It was a way to express myself in ways that I hadn't been able to before. So I really got in touch with myself, and there's a lot of similarities between acting and psychology. And I've noticed that more and more over the years. So I fell in love with that. Was really unfulfilled in marketing at the time, and with the encouragement and support from my wife at the time, I quit my job and tried acting full time, and writing as well. Pretty quickly realized that wasn't for me. I still love writing and acting, but the insecurity of work was not for me. I am not that. I'm a little risk averse in some ways, and for me, that just created so much anxiety. Like, you're always looking for the next job, and just that lack of security. I was married already at the time, so it did more harm than good for me. I was anxious all the time. So when you show up to auditions anxious, you're gonna have a hard time playing a character well. You kind of reek of desperation. At least I did. So that lifestyle wasn't for me at the time. So still love acting and writing. Haven't done it in a while, but still have a love for it. And then, so I went from unfulfilled to like the extreme of, I want to be totally fulfilled completely, but there's not a lot of money in that. So it's like, how do you balance the two? And it took me a really long time. I did a few other jobs, kind of went back into marketing for a little while, back to being unfulfilled. But at the time, it was kind of a placeholder to figure out, like, what is my next step? And there's always been this little voice in the back of my head telling me to go into psychology. You know, I've been in therapy myself as a client for a long time. It probably saved my life. I have found it incredibly rewarding being on the client end of things. It really helped me discover who I am. So I see a lot of young men and just people in the world that on similar journeys as myself and just feeling lost at times, feeling unfulfilled. And then when I started to feel a little more secure in who I was, it was kind of like, okay, I kind of want to be a part of the solution for other people and finding themselves. So that voice in the back of my head got a little louder and a little louder until I finally pulled the trigger and decided to go back to school to study psychology for my master's. And one of the best decisions I ever made. And earlier, I tended to go into things somewhat quickly. Like, I really want to do this at the time, so I'm going to rush into this, and because it looks sexy or it has the promise of money, or so I would jump into things. But with this, I kept thinking as that voice got louder and louder, if I'm going to jump into this, I want to be sure. So I took my time. I think that idea kind of first happened. It took me about a year as I first had that thought, like, I think I'm going to go back to school. And then I continued to think about it, explore who I was, what I wanted. And after about a year, that's when I pulled the trigger. And like I said, one of the best decisions I've ever made. So, yeah, I mean, that's the long story long right there about how I got into.
Yeah, there's about a million questions I could ask you about everything I just heard. But one thing that kind of stuck out to me was that idea of feeling unfulfilled, right? Because I feel like there's a lot of kids my age that I know, even friends of mine from high school or kids that I've met in the past couple of years, where it's like they're kind of wandering a bit and they don't have the fulfillment, and some of them try and find it in making money, or they try and find it in like a woman, or just in anything except looking internally and saying like, where's my worth at? And so I'm curious, why exactly did you feel unfulfilled? I'm sure looking back retrospectively, you could probably answer that question now to some degree, but why did you feel so unfulfilled?
That's an amazing question. And I think you already kind of hit the nail on the head of, I felt unfulfilled because I wasn't looking internally. I was looking towards quick money, or what's going to get me recognition or validation from other people, what's going to make my parents love me, what's going to get their approval, what's going to make my wife happy, just all these pressures from everywhere else, and not a lot of searching from within initially. And that is what led to a lot of a lack of fulfillment there. And I think it's okay to wander. It's okay to wander for a bit, as long as you're exploring who you are and what you actually want. And what I found was effective in that was like undoing all the defenses that I have, all the insecurities. If I get rid of all of that, how do I want to spend my days? You know, if I had $1 billion, like, what would I do? You know, not with the money, but what would I do with my day? And it came down to helping people, or giving back, or helping people explore themselves. And if that's what I want to do with my day, then why don't I do that now, even without $1 billion, right? So, yeah, I think I wandered for a bit, and it was okay because I was on that journey of exploration. Yeah. So if you're wandering, though, looking for a way to fill a void in yourself, if you try to fill it with someone else, that's a route that's always going to lead to nowhere. I think you need to fill any void from within.
That's good.
And if you could figure out how to fill that, I think that is where you should go, or what you should lean into.
That's awesome. No, I'm very curious for your story. Like, what exactly prompted you to start looking internally? Because I mean, there's guys like Jordan Peterson, for example, right, who are these like voices for men these days, and a bunch of, you know, young adults, men in particular, are going to figures like that, and they're getting that kind of advice to like figure yourself out and take responsibility and stuff like that. So you mentioned that you had been a client in the therapy sphere, and that was a huge part of it. Would you say that was the biggest part in getting you to look internally and figure those things out?
Yeah. That was a big part for sure. I think it also takes the right therapist at the right time, because I had been in therapy since I was, a late teenager, and some of those experiences were really great, but I think it's kind of like scaffolding. I think at the time, if you had given me at, 16 years old, some of the messages or some of the insight that I received from my therapist when I was, 25, at 15 or 16, I would not have been ready to hear it. So it's scaffolding. You have to kind of build up to that. And I think the therapist that I found good fits for the times in my life that helped me build up to that. And I think my therapist when I was in my mid-20s really helped me look more internally. At that time in my life, that's what I needed to do. Whereas when I was younger, 15, 16 years old, it was a little less looking internally and more about like dealing with difficult emotions and coping and figuring out, where I'm going to go to school. But I think as I got older, it was more maybe existential questions. And I think the timing had a lot to do with it, and the person that was in my life at that time as a therapist.
That's good. Yeah, and that's kind of...
And truthfully, what helped me look internally was misery. Just being completely fucking depressed and unhappy, and you have no choice but to try to figure it out at that point. Like, what's the alternative? To kill yourself? Like, I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about that at the time. But you got two choices: kill yourself or figure it out. And it's like, killing yourself's a permanent solution to a temporary problem, So you kind of put one foot in front of the other and keep going, and just have faith that you figure it out, or, just keep going. And that's kind of what I did. And just a lot of struggle, a lot of misery, a lot of depression at the time, just trying to crawl myself out of a hole. And eventually I things just started clicking, and I started figuring out little things about who I was, and kind of went from there. And what helped me to do so, actually, to add to that, is what helped me figure out who I was at the time was I stripped down everything in the sense of, like, what do I know about myself for sure? Like, because if I take away my parents' approval, because, like, what are the decisions I'm making for myself that I am sure about, that I want for myself and not for recognition or approval? And once I took that all away, it's like, what are the facts? The facts are, I like baseball, right? Like, simple things. Like, what do I know for sure? I like baseball. Like, that brings me joy. Okay, what else do I know for sure? Okay, I like pizza. I like my dog. Okay, so you strip everything else away, and you could kind of build from there about what feels good to me, and then you explore that more and more, and then it became, okay, I like helping people. I like helping people in this lane, not so much in that lane. I tried financial advising at one point, and it was like, okay, I like helping people, but I don't like helping them with their money. That doesn't feel good to me. So you kind of take what you know for sure, and then just kind of build and build and build from there. And that helped me gain more insight into who I was and what I wanted.
That's good. No, I think one thing that I kind of want to touch on there is you talking about people hitting like a rock bottom sort of situation. Because when I look at my own life, I think if you asked me if I was in those situations at the moment, if like this was good for me, I probably would have said no. Like, I'm upset and in misery, and I want this to go away. But now looking back, even at things that are just like a year or two ago, it's like, dude, like, I'm like way different now because of that. And so I'm sure you can say the same thing about stuff that you've gone through. Now,
for sure,
maybe there's little tweaks you could change, but overall, I think you would probably say something along the lines of like, it was good that I went through that to become who I am now.
You learn more in defeat than you do in victory. And every obstacle, getting on the other side of that, every obstacle was an opportunity to learn and to grow. But when things are going smooth, you don't learn as much from that. So it's painful, but pain is necessary for happiness. Pain is a reference point, because if I don't have that reference point of struggle and misery, then once I get to the other side, I won't have anything to compare it to. So I need to experience misery and pain to look back and be like, that was really hard. And now look where I'm at. Okay, now I'm happy because I've worked through certain things. But if I'm just always like this, if I'm always happy, if there's an absence of misery at any point in life, then that is misery. There is no happiness because there's no reference point. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that's the same kind of argument as like without, light, there's no dark, and that whole thing, like the yin yang situation of life, right? I feel like when I look at, like, especially back in high school, because Southern California is a pretty rich area. There's a lot of people with a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so I'd look at, kids, especially my age, who were financially fortunate, and I'd say, okay, like, it kind of looks like their life's going smooth, and like, all right, now they have this apartment in Newport Beach as a 20-year-old, and now they're like, I'm like, that's the life. Mm-hmm. And there's no hardship being experienced there. And then all of a sudden I come to find out that these kids have gone off the rail in some sense. And I'm like, what happened? Like, I thought your life was going really good. And so, not that you'd wish that on people, but it kind of makes you look internally and go, well, you know what? I'm kind of glad I either didn't have that much money or that I had to go through that tough breakup, because it's like, at some point, everyone's going to have to experience, some sort of like soul shattering part of their life where, you have to put the pieces back together and really figure out who you are, like you said, and look internally. So I completely agree with what you're saying there.
It's interesting. I see it a lot now with certain young men that I work with whose parents, whether they're helicopter parents or just really fortunate families that basically just do everything for their kids and hold their hand the whole way. And the message that sends to the kid is, if I'm holding your hand the whole way, it's, I don't think you can do it. Let me do it for you. And then when they grow older and they are forced to become more independent, because, no one wants to be like a 40-year-old living in their mother's basement, right? That's the what's the word I'm looking for? That's like the model that we see in movies, the 40-year-old living in his mother's basement.
The archetype of
So it's like at a certain point you don't want that. So it's like, okay, I want to be independent. There's this drive to become independent, but if I've never been forced to learn these things to become independent, then I'm gonna suffer. Yeah. And those opportunities for these kids are taken away sometimes by the parents, and they end up suffering more as a result. Kids need to get hurt to some degree to understand their limits, to learn. As kids, as babies are learning to walk, they need to fall, within reason. You want to make it safe. You want to make sure they fall, but fall on pillows, right? You don't want it to be life or death, but you need to experience a fall in order to learn, in order to grow, in order to figure out who you are and what you're capable of.
Sure. No. I do want to switch lanes a little bit and talk about maybe how you met your wife and that whole situation. I'm kind of curious, coming as a marriage and family kind of therapist, what your story was on finding your spouse.
Yeah. Man, talking about falling flat on your face at first, I went through a breakup with a girlfriend that just devastated me at the time. And at the time it was like, oh, I'm never going to get over this. This is terrible. And then looking back on it after having met my wife and gotten married, it's like that breakup was the best thing that ever happened. So it's funny how perspective changes once you get to the other side. But I met my wife through a great mutual friend named Alicia. I went to college with Alicia, the University of Arizona, and my wife was and is still Alicia's best friend from home, from Orange County. And so on like breaks from school, so like spring break or winter break or whatever, I would drive from, where I lived with my family in Southern California to Orange County or vice versa, and just kind of hang out with the whole group. And that's how I met my wife, and kind of hit it off then, but she went to a different school. And then once we graduated, she moved out to LA, started spending more time together, and the rest was history there. But yeah. But I mean, relationships are work though still. So marriage is, we have one daughter now and one on the way. So
congratulations.
Thank you very much. But it's just funny how marriage and relationships evolve over the years, and you're always learning something new even with that, and putting in work to discover yourself and discover the relationship and who you both are and just how you can improve and be better. I don't think you ever get to a point where you're just done putting in the work, So whether that's on yourself or within the relationship.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. Relationships these days, right? I think a lot of men are out for themselves, and I think vice versa, a lot of women are out for themselves, and that can kind of turn it into a bit of a transactional marketplace of pleasure, so to speak, if you want to put it that way.
For sure.
And so I guess I'm kind of curious, like if you had like a young man, say he's fresh into college or fresh out of college for that matter, and he comes to you and he's like, hey, what do I need to look for in a woman that is going to give me the best possible chance of success in our relationship in the future? Like what type of, what qualities, characteristics would you recommend?
Yeah, I think truthfully, the landscape has changed since when I was, single. So I haven't personally experienced like Tinder or Bumble or these dating apps, because by the time I met my wife, those weren't really even started yet. So that's something a lot of my friends have gone through. So I picked their brain about it. But I think, what would you look for in a woman? I think, what do they value? I think values tell us so much about people. Like that is the root of so much. So what do I value? And it's complicated in the sense of if a woman values a purse, right? Okay, materialistic item, all right. But what if she is in love with the design of that purse? What if it's the what's the word I'm looking for? The aesthetic of it. What if she's in love with materials? What if it's deeper? What if it's a passion, right? So that value, I don't think, is a negative quality. But if it's a shallow value, and I don't think people are bad people for that, but I think there's an insecurity there and it's worth exploring. Okay, well, if you're insecure, how is that driving your behavior? And I think if you get to the root of it and people's values don't necessarily align with yours, I think it is pretty difficult to make a relationship work under those circumstances. But I'm not saying if someone's insecure, they're not worthy of being in a relationship. But I think if you look past the insecurity, what is the value there? What is going on underneath the surface? And if that doesn't jive with what is underneath the surface for you, then maybe it's not compatible. That's kind of a non-committal answer I just gave you, but I don't think there's one thing to look for in a woman or in a man. I think it's, does this person match what I believe in and what I want to accomplish in life, both together in a relationship and just goals for the future individually and as a couple. But I agree. I think it's harder. There's a lot more noise out there today, even with social media, and it's this clickbait environment and just, swiping right on everybody. There's just so much noise, so it's harder to get to the root of values because there's more bullshit on top of it than there used to be. Yeah, I think it's difficult. It's difficult.
I think what you just said there was absolutely spot on, because I feel like in my own experience and other kids that I've witnessed my age, because of how transactional things have become these days, it's almost like, okay, I think I'm attractive. I think you're attractive. We like each other. Let's date. Let's go to the movies. Let's go to the beach. Let's hang out. But there's not much communication going on, and not much like digging deep and finding out who is this person? There's not much vulnerability going on, right? And so I feel like in my past relationships, up until the one that I'm in now, there's been virtually no meaningful communication. And because now there is meaningful communication, it's like, okay, I know you for who you are.
Yeah.
For who you could be, even if it's like negative things about you.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, because that's real.
That is real.
And I guarantee you, I'm sure you can speak on this because I'm not married, but that stuff comes up when you're married, when you're in a relationship for a long time. Like you find out who they are.
It's so funny. I just had a conversation yesterday with a therapist friend of mine about how me and my wife and him and his wife, we have very similar. This was a similar experience where he was telling me the closest I feel to my wife sometimes is right after a fight. And that resonated so much with me because after the fight, once you get down to what was underneath the fight, you feel more connected. You see where they're coming from. And that's, the term soulmate, that's kind of what it is like, let me see all the shit, the negative stuff, the positives. Just let me see you for you. And fights typically bring out, just not initially, but once you deconstruct the fight, what's this really about? Then it's like, okay, I see the vulnerability. I see what this was all about underneath the surface. Because it's not about dirty dishes, right? It's about what do dirty dishes, what's the message you're receiving from me when you see that? And if we can get to that, we could understand each other and see each other and meet each other and really know, what's going on. Who are we and what do you need from me?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's tough to do because at first in this relationship that I'm in now, I was afraid to mention something that might cause quarreling, right? Because in the past I had been in situations, right, where I say something and all of a sudden that turns into a huge problem and then that results in a breakup. And it's like, it's not because what I mentioned was terrible and should have been the cause of our relationship ending, but it's because both of us were afraid to actually have tough conversations.
Yeah.
And that didn't lead us to grow closer to each other. So now, and I've kind of gotten over this and it's been easier the more that I've done it, but I'm not afraid to say those tough things anymore. And it's like, there was this quote that I heard a while ago. It was like, what you need most sometimes is where you least want to look. And it's like, you don't want to look in the closet of your partner or of yourself and say like, I've got this insecurity, or like, maybe I have a little bit of trust issues, and you don't want to address it. And it's like, those things come to bite you if you don't do things about them. Sure. And so maybe speak a little bit on how communication has played a role in your marriage, and maybe if also, are you and your wife the same people, so to speak, as you were when you met?
No, definitely not. We're both very different people than when we met. So it has definitely evolved. And the only way to get through that is communication. So communication, it is very difficult at times. There's a lot of shame with certain things for individuals, and looking in shameful places is not easy. Vulnerability is not easy, but if you want connection, that's where you have to go. And an analogy I use a lot actually in therapy with clients is in the movie 8 Mile, and this is, I don't know if you youngsters know what 8 Mile was, but it's Eminem's movie. And I'm going to spoil part of it, but if you haven't seen it at this point, that's kind of on you. But in like the last rap battle of 8 Mile, Eminem basically, he goes first in the battle, and he basically owns all of his shit. He basically, instead of attacking the other guy first, he goes, I am white. I am a bum. He says all the negative shit about himself. And when he owns that, it took away all the ammunition that people have against him. So then when they hand the mic to the other guy had nothing to say. Because he just owned all of his shame, all of his negativity, all the weaknesses. If you own that, it loses its power. So I think it's hard to look at shame. It's been hard for me. Like, what am I shameful about? My wife has been the breadwinner the entirety of our marriage, and she has supported me when I was a fucking bum, when I was acting, making nothing. And I think that's hard for me to look at those times and to talk about how shameful some of those moments were for me. But I think that's the only way that I can know myself as a person. And that's the only way that our communication in the marriage works, is if we own every aspect of ourselves and we own all the family traumas and bullshit that we've been through. And, everyone's got defenses. Everyone's got insecurities. But if I can be aware of hers, then when it presents itself, I can give her the love that she might need in that moment, right? So if I understand her triggers when I see it, because she might not see it because she's triggered. When I see it, I could slow things down for her, give her a hug, and give her what she needs, give her the love in that moment, and vice versa. When my triggers pop up, if she sees it, she could then give me the nurturance and the love that I need. So communicating what our hot spots might be, and just communication in general, that's everything.
Sure. Yeah, no. And plus I feel like when you don't want to communicate or don't have the willpower to do so, like that can kind of breed some resentment for your partner, not even just your partner, but in like regular relationships themselves. Like say for example, you feel shame about her being the breadwinner, right? Like you don't voice that can start to like grow inside you. And all of a sudden one day it's like, you just blow up, and you could have prevented that.
Yeah,
right.
For sure. And that's not my natural tendency. Like the way I grew up, I just never really felt like I had so much of a voice. So my natural tendency when I'm upset is to close off and shut down. That is my natural tendency. And that is something that we've had to work through. And I'm still working on just when I'm frustrated or feeling upset or slighted or anything, I'm still working through, bringing that up, communicating it. That is not my natural state. So you're never done, you're always working towards it. My communication is better than it was a year ago, 5 years ago, but I still have a ways to go, but it's definitely made it a healthier dynamic the more I've been willing to learn and grow. Some people, it's uncomfortable doing something different. So some people like the comfort, and comfort prevents growth. So it makes it difficult if you're not willing to put that effort and growth in. It makes it difficult for a relationship to evolve and to eventually thrive.
Sure. Yeah. Speaking on comfort and growth, what would you say to the disenfranchised young man today who's afraid to put his foot out there and afraid to, take hold of his life, right? Whether he feels insecure about his looks or about his, any kind of insecurity. What's your advice to them to say, hey, step out, you got to take this step, or else, you might end up somewhere that you could have prevented?
It's scary, and I acknowledge that. And if you're afraid, you're not wrong. You don't get to a point where you're not necessarily afraid. you get to a point where you're afraid and you move forward anyway. So fear is part of the process. But the only way forward is to just jump. And it is scary. It is terrifying. But the only way we learn is by getting out of our comfort zone. That's the only way. Otherwise, we're stagnant.
There's this, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but the idea of like exposure therapy, right? Mm-hmm. And this is something that's like a staple in clinical psychology and I'm sure counseling as well. And I think what I recall is that when patients get exposed to things that they're afraid of, like say someone's afraid of like the stairs, right? Like this could be the simplest fear. And they get close to the stairs and then one day they go down one step and that's it for that day. Mm-hmm. And then eventually they make it down the stairs. And the idea is like, they don't become less afraid, but they become braver instead. Yeah. And then they're able to do those things, right? I think that's kind of a similar idea to what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And it's about scaffolding, right? Building upon the courage, you know? If I'm afraid and I'm trying to, you know, tackle the biggest thing all at one time, like that, if I'm looking up at Mount Everest, I'm never going to climb it. But if I focus on take one step in the right direction, okay, I could take one step. I took one, I could take one more. Mountains are climbed one step at a time. Yeah. So it's about building and scaffolding.
That's good.
And that's how we overcome.
So let's talk about resources then for people these days, because I know there's obviously there's in-person therapy, and I know at least at UC Irvine you have access to a counselor. And there's even online services, right, where you can go and actually sign up for like a subscription or pay a fee and get the opportunity to speak to a counselor. And if I'm not mistaken, you can actually kind of flip through those counselors until you find somebody that you mesh well with and then stick with them.
Yeah.
So what's your recommendation?
I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. At the end of the day, I think it's about finding the right fit for you. And that's a difficult question to answer, because even when I say that, the right fit for you, if I'm looking for a therapist to just be a yes person, if that's what I want, I can find that. But is that the right therapist for me? And sometimes it's about what you need and not what you want. So you have to be honest with yourself about what you need. You have to be honest with yourself and then find the right fit for that. And there's a lot of services out there. I'm not going to name names, but I think the concept behind a lot of these online services is good. I think it provides accessibility to therapy, which is great. Which is absolutely great. There are systemic issues within therapy that make that model not great. Those online platforms typically pay therapists far below the going rate for what a therapist should make. And the problems that arise with that is a lot of the therapists on those platforms might be a therapist that is just looking for numbers of clients and just, you know, going really quick. So the quality of the work might not be up to par. And then what happens, I think, is there's a trickle-down effect where clients might have a therapist and have a negative experience on one of these platforms. And this might be the client's first experience with therapy. So they go into these situations with a therapist that might not be up to par, and then they're like, okay, therapy doesn't work. And then that turns that client away from therapy. So I know that's not every case. I know that. I know there's a lot of good that could come from that, but there's harm out there as well. So I think it's a very delicate situation, and I think it takes careful consideration. And I think insurance companies have a long way to go in terms of paying therapists fair wages. And I think that's part of the problem. So ultimately, it creates less accessibility in a lot of scenarios to getting quality therapy. Okay. So I think there's certain steps moving in the right direction, but I think we have a long way to go to make it more accessible and higher quality. But for a client, I would say be honest with yourself about what you need and then find someone that can deliver that. Okay,
so taking a step back from that, how do we get over the stigma of therapy, of going to see a therapist, a clinician, a shrink even, right? Yeah. Like there's all these terms, right? And I know that as a young man, even I've felt this, where it's like there's been times in my life where I've been, sad, and I could definitely have used somebody to talk to, but I always thought there's no way I'm going to a therapist. Like I need to man up. I need to not go to a therapist. Like, what's your solution? What are you telling these kids?
What I'm telling these kids is, and this is coming from someone who has manned up for a long time. Manning up is bullshit. Manning up is bullshit. Now, yes, you need to have a thick skin and be tough at times, but that doesn't mean being stoic and being not having feelings, right? That everyone has feelings. So if your definition of manning up is suppressing your feelings, that is going to lead you to a place of depression and just misery, because your feelings are there anyway, even if you choose not to look at them. And if you choose not to look at them, that's a recipe for disaster. So manning up is bullshit. And what I will say is the way we get over the stigma is by talking about it. That is the point of this. That is the point, to talk about it. I am just as much of a man as anyone else out there, and so are you. And talking about our feelings doesn't make you less of a man. It wasn't until I started talking about my feelings that I felt strong and more like a man. So we need to talk about it. That's how we get over the stigma.
Absolutely. That's good. Well, I think as we wrap up here, where can people find you? How can people get in contact with you if they want to, book a session with you or start talking to you, right?
Yeah, silverlinepsych.com is our website. So if you need help, reach out. There's plenty of resources out there. So if you reach out, and even if we're not the right fit, we would be happy to guide you to help and the resources that you need. So silverlinepsych.com, Guy Problems Podcast. From there, click on the links, click the like buttons, and you'll be able to follow that trail and find the contact info as well. It'll be on there also. But thank you. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for asking me such thought-provoking questions. And thanks for sharing part of your experience as well.
Absolutely. I'd love to do this again.
Likewise.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.